that is being driven by some past things. I know this. Sometimes the things that we hunger for come because of unmet needs in our life. Now listen, I don't want to get too psychological here, but I was working with a couple of years ago. And they were in an unhealthy relationship, and as I was talking with them, it was so interesting when I began to just kind of talk to them about this relationship. And it was actually, one of them said to me that what was happening, they were living outside of the boundaries of how God would have them to live. And they were not married yet, and they were sexually active, and we were talking through this. And they looked at me, and he said to me, he says, I'll be honest with you, I'm not even interested in the sexual side of this thing, but I just so deeply desire to have someone treat me affectionately. Is it wrong to want affection? No. Is it wrong to want relationship? No. But is it healthy to fulfill that outside of the way that God has designed? Yes, it's unhealthy. The third thing I know about these appetites is that all of us, strike this, all of us have appetites that we must be aware of. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes that we can make as believers, as born-again believers in Jesus Christ, is for us not to be aware of where our weaknesses are. Now, I realize that we talk about a lot of different aspects. Let's not go to the extremes. All of us have low points in the wall where the enemy loves to attack. And believe me, he knows where they're at. We were reading the book of Nehemiah this last week on our Wednesday night Bible study. And one of the things that I found very interesting, and I stopped and just made a note on this, is that at the low point, when they were rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, they put the guards at the lowest spot in the wall. And I just stopped and said, hey, this is for free, but do you notice where the enemy always wants to attack? The enemy always wants to attack where? At the lowest point in the wall. And you will find in your life that in those weak areas, that's where the enemy attacks. I was at last week, we were back home for a couple of days, and I went to our 25th high school reunion. We went to just a little portion of it. And actually, to be honest with you, there weren't very many people there. And so we were kind of talking around, and they were actually talking about the fellowship time that they had the night before. And they mentioned a guy who actually was a friend of mine, in fact, continued to be a friend of mine outside of high school. And they mentioned that he had been there. And I haven't seen this guy in probably 15, 17 years. Right? We kind of lost touch after we moved away to Iowa and such. And what's really interesting is they made a comment. They said, yep, he has had a measure of success. And they mentioned the amount of success they've had. And they said, and by the way, if you don't know it, he'll tell you that within 30 seconds. I thought that was so interesting. They were kind of sitting there saying, you know what? He'll make sure you know it. There's something in him that just needs to let you know immediately how successful he's become. Have you ever noticed that you tend to see the appetites in other people? You tend to see the Esau syndrome in other people better than you do yourself? That's why we need people in our life who can speak to us. The big lesson I want you to take from this is that poor decisions often come when we are spiritually, emotionally, or physically depleted. When I was a young pastor, and I wasn't going to share this, but for some reason last night when I was preaching, Lord just put this story on my mind, and I feel like I need to share it with somebody today. When I was a young pastor, I was 23 years old, and I was pastoring in Warsaw, Indiana, and I had always had a policy that when I counsel, especially when I counsel women, I would never do it alone. I would always have someone. I was the only pastor. In fact, when I went to Warsaw, when we first went there, the church, it was just so fragile. It was barely hanging on. I think we had something like 25 to 30 people in our first Sunday. It was barely hanging on. And so I told Tammy, I was dumb, I was young, I didn't know what I was doing. And I told Tammy, I said, these people are so discouraged. For the next year, I am going to kill myself, and I'm going to put this church on my back, and I'm going to carry it Now, I don't know if that's smart or not, but it seemed at the time that's what I should do. So I literally started doing everything around the church. I started mowing the lawn. Now, that may not be a big deal to you, but it was a 5-acre lawn. We had 15 acres. 5 of it was in grass. We had a Murray 36-inch deck mower. It took 6 hours to mow that thing. I'd put on my headset and I'd get out there on a Friday afternoon. We'd just do it. Man, if the snow needed to be scraped, I'd scrape the snow. If the church for a long time, just clean the church. If there was somebody made a mess on the kid threw up on the floor, I'd clean it up. I mean, I was teaching the classes. I was preaching. There were about 5 lessons I was doing a week. And I got to be honest with you, after about a year, we had a little bit of growth, but I was just tired. And I remember there was a time when I had an individual who we had begun a counseling relationship, just met a couple of times, kind of lost track. She was a younger lady, and she called me and she said, I'm having some difficulties. I really need to meet with you. And so I said, okay, we set up a time. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I called my wife and I said, Tammy, I said, hey, I've got a counseling appointment. In fact, it was that day, or the day of. I said, I got a counseling appointment. I need you to be there at the church with me. And she said, Phil, I can't be there. I got to be out of town. I said, oh, it's okay. It's okay. There'll be somebody else there. And so I called another gal who was always there working on the bulletin stuff. She couldn't be there that day. And I thought, you know what? It's just this once. Just once. No big deal. But I remember a pastor friend had told me, he said, Phil, he says, I just feel like I need to tell you, be careful. He said, when you are tired, when you are worn out, when you are spiritually depleted, even doing good things, he says, be careful. You'll do things you wouldn't have otherwise done. But I just kept on trucking. I thought, this is okay. I'm young. I'm strong. I know what I'm doing. And I decided before this counseling appointment, I was going to go ahead and get a bite to eat. And I was on my way up to Great Wall China. It was a good restaurant. And I pulled into the parking lot, and I was listening to Dr. James Dobson. And he said this. He said, 85% of all pastoral infidelity begins in the counseling room. And the Spirit of God just hit me upside the head. It was like a 2x4. And he said, Phil, you are being stupid. I think that's what he said. It was something like that. And I realized, man, I had a conviction. I was being dumb. I was being dumb. I called our church organist, Kay, and I said, Kay, I told her everything. I said, Kay, I don't know what it is, but I feel like somebody has got to be there. She said, Pastor, what am I going to do? I said, just come and start practicing the organ. I said, just come. I said, I don't care why you're here, just be here. She says, okay. And so Kay showed up, started practicing the organ. The lady showed up. I said, hey, Kay's here. I said, we're just going to leave the door open. And I said, hey, she's going to play real quietly here. She has to practice for Sunday. Can I tell you, that lady was there for 5 minutes. She got up and she walked out. I have no idea, but I am convinced in my mind that God simply used that conviction to prepare my heart and say, Phil, do not put yourself in a position whereby you can make a foolish choice. Do you know there are some that are here today and you're tired. You're emotionally tired. You're physically tired. You might even be spiritually tired for good reasons. And you are facing some decisions right now, and I want to tell you, beware. The enemy knows how to attack when we are tired, to make decisions we otherwise would not have made. Somebody needs to hear that today. Number 2, the second thing we need to see about the Esau syndrome is that our appetites often force us to live today at the expense of tomorrow. Do you notice he uses the word quick? He says, quick, give me some food. I'm famished, I'm starving. You will find oftentimes how the enemy, that it's something that we feel like it has to be dealt with quickly, but the problem is the payment comes later. The way that I describe this is the illustration of a credit card. Any of you ever used a credit card before? Raise your hand. If any of you ever purchased something on a credit card that later on you're like, oh shoot, now I got to pay for this thing. Any of you ever done that before? Most of us have done that. I know some of you have never done that, but most of us have done that. It's a couch you bought. You put something on quickly, right? It's like, oh, no pain, I got the money. But then later on, when you got to pay for it, it gets to be painful. The fact is that sometimes we make decisions in life quickly that later on comes the price tag, and it's a lot more painful than we thought it was going to be. That's why our moral compass has to be so true north. It has to be so disciplined in us that when we make quick decisions, that we make right decisions.